Okay, guys, today we are finishing up World War II and the home front with the areas that we didn't get to with women in the military, Japanese internment camps, and the atomic bombs. So the first thing we're going to talk about is women in the military and looking at some of the changes that took place during World War II. Now, in the past wars, women did participate in the military, but not officially. So that's an important distinction that we're going to be looking at, and certainly not to discredit that there were lots of women who were active in the various wars throughout, from the Revolutionary War onward, who were active participants in these wars. But what had not been present was the official recognition into the military. So they were like the Red Cross or unofficial nurses before that, or camp followers if you go all the way back to the Revolutionary War, which then they actually stepped into often their husband's position if he fell or was injured during a battle, along with, of course, women who, with the Revolutionary War and Civil War, actually disguised themselves as men to fight. So that there's a long-standing tradition within U.S. history of women participating in the war, either as support service or directly fighting as well. One of the things that changed with World War II was that they decided to officially recognize women into the military as an official military unit. Now, there's a couple different groups, and then we're going to look at some more specifics, but I want to put those groups up. WAC, or Women's Army Corps, was the one that officially recognized and brought women into the military. So they had, we'll put a couple of things with each, and then we'll get into more details with that. They actually had an official uniform. They were officially part of the Army, which is important because to be officially part of the Army, then that leads to not only with wages, but pensions, retirement, access to things that other service members would get that women never received before because they weren't officially part of the military. And that played a huge role in, we'll say, training and jobs as well. And we'll look again, we're going to look at that a little bit more specifically here after we just address the different groups. The numbers for WAC were around 140,000 women who were part of the Women's Army Corps. The next group were the Waves. Now, these next two groups that we're looking at, well, I guess there's one other one we'll look at too, which was a more unofficial, overreaching title. But this next group, and all the ones subsequent from there, were not officially part of the military. So the only one that was officially part of the military was WAC. The others were variants of volunteer groups. So WAVE stands for Women Accepted Volunteer, and so then there is the volunteer part of it, right, rather than the official emergence into the Navy. Women Accepted Volunteer Emergency Service. So a long acronym there, and this was for the Navy. So they were not official, or not officially a branch, a part of the Navy, not the military or the Navy. Instead, they were a volunteer emergency service. And so in that way, they didn't get some of the benefits that WAC did. Of the military. Then you had Oh, and for the numbers there, that was around 100,000 women. The next group were nurses. And nurses served in all branches, well, most branches. And they weren't part of the Marines, although there were nurses that were stationed with the Marines, but usually coinciding with the Navy and the Army. The Navy and the Army were the two main areas that women as nurses were stationed with, but there were areas with the Marines were present, and other groups were as well, or at bases, women as nurses were present. And from there, you had 76,000 women that were nurses, and these could take place as contractors who worked directly with the Army or the Navy, or groups like the Red Cross that also were hired women to be nurses with the official part of the program. The last group was Wasp, and this was women Air Force service pilots. And they were also not, they didn't have any military official recognition. They were seen as civilian pilots who were volunteering or serving. They did get some money, but the idea being is that you were like a civilian contractor, essentially. And this was a much smaller group. While you had 25,000 applicants, only 1,074 women served. And that was because of very select specific rules and expectations, and we'll get to that as well. And this was actually disbanded before the war was over because of the controversy. So this was by far the most controversial of the different groups where women participated. So there was a lot of different branches and things where women participated and were active in the military, but WAC being the official. So we're going to look a little bit more at WAC and what was going on there. Women's jobs typically followed conventional patterns of peacetime. So they were traditionally considered female jobs. And so this would be looking at secretary, clerks, telephone operators, jobs that were seen as female based before the war itself. They had there were some other positions, and it didn't mean that those were the only ones. There were women that had jobs outside of the traditional roles, but they were few and far between. The majority of women who were in WAC served within that kind of acceptable role. But you did have some women who were welders and mechanics, along with drivers. But again, those numbers were a lot smaller. Anything that was a skilled job, that was considered a skilled job, were a lot less open, even if women wanted to do them. Now, part of the reason why there was an emphasis on these more traditional roles was two parts. One, of course, just the expectation that you had that women would work in jobs that they always did. But the second part was the fear of women becoming unfeminine somehow, that by putting on a military uniform and somehow working within the military in any capacity, that there was a defeminization with women in the military. Just like we saw with women in the war industry. That fear was still there and present within the military, if not more so. In fact, it was definitely even more concern, because just the idea, and this is why this has been resisted, it's acceptable for women to volunteer in the military. But the instant that you have an official formal military uniform, that was something that was for men. That was a male uniform. It wasn't meant for men. And certainly the idea, of course, that the military and war were also for men. And so women were invading into a role that was not for them. And that somehow just the uniform itself would somehow make you less feminine in nature. And this required WAC to defend that women, the decision to have women in the military. And how they defended it was to state that that they, one, were doing jobs that women as civilians do, right? And so that's why there was such an emphasis on those traditional female jobs, because then they could argue, like, look, there's no difference in what they would do in the civilian world as in the military world. But then the other part that was connected to it is that they also argued that they're doing jobs that the military had found difficult for men, enlisted men, to do. And what that meant was that these jobs that were seen as tedious and boring, that they gave them to the women. Enlisted men to do. But so that's here. That's the translation with that, is repetition, boring, tedious work. White, that would be work for women. Men don't like to do that, but these women are willing to do so, and they're good at that type of work. So look, it's jobs that men wouldn't do anyways. That's kind of the other part with that, is that men wouldn't do it anyways. And that's the kind of argument for saying, well, they're not taking male jobs, they're not moving into a male role. These are jobs that men wouldn't do because they're seen as feminine roles. And so no, don't worry about that. You don't have to see it as they're somehow going to become a man. But there was this constant pushback that, yeah, if you weren't careful, that they would somehow change into a man at some point, because of this military uniform component on it. The other argument that they made, and they published an article on it, was that the women, they reported to the New York Times. It was the press release from WAC, and they gave a report to the New York Times that said of WAC, and this was again a direct quote from the WAC press person specifically, and what it said is that women will always be a civilian at heart, which is somewhat downplaying the role of women as official military service women, and saying, like, well, okay, yeah, they are you know, technically in the military, but don't worry, they're not really military. They're always going to see themselves as civilian first, rather than as a military person. The other thing that they said was that her service in WAC will increase her femininity, which also shows you that concern of the role of defeminization, right? That somehow, I mean, that just that proves that this idea was floating around, that there was this constant concern and fear that somehow women weren't, you know, they were going to lose their femininity, so much so that they had to put out a press release to suggest that. And then they went further and said, you know, what women really want is when the war is over, they will go back to a home, married, and children. Now, women in the army with WAC were not married or had children, unlike the war industry, which was part of that. But the argument is right, that they're not going to stay. This is a temporary thing, and that goes directly with the argument with the war industry, right? That it was temporary and altruistic. That it was something that was patriotic, but it was not something that women would stay in after the war was over. That they would go back to whatever role they were planning on playing before the war happened. And so that sets up that it's a big step for women, and certainly isn't, I don't want to diminish that component of it. It was a really big step for allowing women officially to be part of the military, and led to an opening for more women to become part of the military in future years. But at the same time, they definitely put it in terms of this idea that women who were part of WAC were only doing so because of this desperate need in wartime, and as soon as war was over, women would no longer be in the military. That this wasn't some kind of career or job. That this was something that was to help out, and so don't worry, you know, you can calm down now, because right, they're not going to stay in this position. And then the last thing that they had to deal with was the rumors, or again, fear that somehow women would become overly sexualized in the military. And that probably comes with, of course, the concepts and ideas of men and sex in the military, and both World War I and World War II. To give you an idea of that, for men here for just a second, the military in World War II actively, they put out posters and warnings through letters and other ways about what STIs, which STDs, like sexually transmitted diseases, and so that's what the STDs. About, and specifically with that, you know, having sex with foreign women could lead to that. And so they weren't trying to stop them. They were trying to warn them that you needed to be prepared, and they handed out condoms to the men. So you do, and then I think I mentioned this at the very end, but there was also the, in one of the women's magazines that was similar to the ones I was talking about with the war industry, it was When Your Husband Comes Home. And in When Your Husband Come Home, so it tells the women, just expect that your husband had sex while he was over there. Whether or not his life was in danger, it could be, and he has a right to have sex with a woman over there. Be grateful that he came back to you, that you're the most important woman and he chose you. And the other was just a dalliance because of you know, his life was on the line. And again, and even specifically, whether it was or not, doesn't matter, because it could have been. And that's just how men are, and you just need to accept that. So you have this expectation, and so that's probably where it comes from, as far as this fear of sexualization, of women becoming overly sexualized and having orgies or going crazy. But nonetheless, there was this hyper focus on it. So for women, right? So these are both for men. They were not doing this for women. For women, they constantly put out reports that women were very moral. So don't worry, right? They're very moral. They're not going to go sleeping around, and high standards. And then, putting out the idea of, well, they're going to want to get a husband anyway later, so they're not going to sleep around. But they refused to hand out any form of birth control to women, because that would imply that would have to acknowledge that they were having sex. And so the easier way, if your whole argument is no, women are not becoming overly sexualized because of the military, look, we don't even need to give them birth control because they aren't having sex. It's a moot issue. And instead focus on praising women's high moral character and standards. But it's that, again, that massive dichotomy that women had to play within this role within WAC. And you see it too in another of the women's magazines that where are we at with that? We'll put 4 here, that I wanted to mention, that just it's this constant push and pull for how women were treated and the expectation and view of women. And this article was the do's and don'ts of wearing a uniform. Now, this was not an official Army thing. This was in a popular magazine, women's magazine. But what's important with it is that it showcases what was going out to the public of expectations for women in uniform. And the dichotomy comes about because of that concern. And both, saying, okay, yeah, this is happening, but at the same time, there's this fear of, of women becoming unfeminine, and that I think it shows the split in just the population about what the role of women was in the war, and whether that these jobs, yes, they were necessary. It's the same thing with the war industry. Yes, this is your patriotic duty. Oh, you are a horrible mother if you work in the war industry. Yes, this is a patriotic duty to be part of WAC, but let's be real careful that you don't become masculine in the process. And so they have the first part they start with is the don't. So we'll look at the don't the don't category, and I'm not going to list all of them. I'll read off them, but I'll put a few of the key ones here. So the first one is don't cut your hair very short. Right. So the idea being that if the women went, then they were wearing a uniform, that cutting their hair short would make it look masculine. It even says, here's the exact quote: "Don't cut your hair very short. A mannish effect is the last thing you want." But at the same time, don't wear long flowing hairdo. So you're not supposed to cut your hair very short, but you also aren't supposed to have super long hair. So it's this, and all of these do's and don'ts create this super tiny margin of apparently where you're acceptable, and it's a very, very narrow margin. Don't have a shiny undressed face. Don't lean over, which means you need to have some makeup on. Don't lean over backwards to look serviceable. The result is too hard on your public that means like don't look too much like military, right? Because the public can't handle that. I mean, that's their argument for that one. Don't wear long nails. They're not practical. Don't paint them luridly. Don't wear frivolous shoes with high heels, open toes, open heels. Don't wear jewelry except a watch. Don't wear a uniform in a nightclub, a cocktail lounge, or a bar. Don't wear it in the evening unless you're on assignment. Don't wear a uniform. Don't wear a uniform in public unless on duty. So this idea of that you shouldn't, as soon as you are done with your work, you should change and go back to civilian clothes, because the public doesn't want to see you walking around in your uniform. Don't smoke or drink in public while in uniform, which again, this was perfectly acceptable for men to do in uniform. In fact, they went around in their uniforms all the time smoking and drinking. But for women, it again was seen as unseemly. And this is what was connected to it. Don't smoke or drink in public while in uniform. Don't swagger or stride along in masculine fashion. Don't assume a self-righteous air as if you were doing more for your country than other women. Don't wear a uniform unless it has real significance. So the idea that there was the that hyper concern about looking masculine, and that the public can't handle women within that structure. So the do's: do choose a feminine coiffure that, but pick something simple, easy to manage. So don't cut your hair too short. Don't wear a long flowing hairdo, but do have a hairdo that's simple and easy to manage. Do cut your hair shorter, but then again, right, not too short. So we'll put that one. Do cut your hair shorter. So do cut your hair shorter, but don't cut your hair very short. Don't wear your hair in a long flowing hairdo, but do have something that looks nice. Do look finished as well as scrubbed. Do look finished as well scrubbed. Be conservative. Use any makeup you require to get a fresh, pretty mind on the job appearance you should have. So do wear some makeup, but the look is supposed to be the fresh, pretty, mind on the job look, whatever that translates to, which is basically don't wear no makeup. Do wear some makeup, but don't wear too much makeup. Do keep your nails rounded. Do wear sturdy low-heeled shoes. Do think before you add a gadget. Is this really useful? Do make it a personal and flexible rule never to wear a uniform except when on duty. So do, which is basically don't wear the uniform in public, but do make it a rule to never wear the uniform in public. And this is again the idea that the public can't handle seeing a bunch of women walking around in military uniform. Do wear it modestly. So there is the concern of over sexualized women, right? You gotta look modest. And do earn your uniform. But the do's and don'ts, the key with this, and the point of why I wanted to read these is to just to show this crazy fine line that the public was kind of expecting women in the military, now that they were officially part of it, to walk. But it's totally consistent with what we saw with women in the war industry, the kind of expectation of participating temporarily. So, you have to maintain your femininity, but at the same time, you have to do these jobs that are essential and needed in the process. But it's a ton of pressure on women to put this in them, to say, these are this strict tiny line, or it's somehow unacceptable. Women were important within the nursing position. Where they did resist was with doctors, where even though there was a massive shortage of physicians until 1943, nursing became acceptable for women as a female role, where doctors were still seen as largely a male dominated role. And that's just consistent, right? It took women being volunteer nurses with the Red Cross in World War I. It took women being unofficial nurses in the Revolutionary War, and then more accepted nurses in the Civil War. So it took several stages to get women even to be seen as nursing as a female profession. And so women as an entryway into doctors, especially within the military, it was a much longer thing to go. Okay, so that was the issues that women had to deal with, the constant fear that women within WAC was maybe not a good thing, because it could hurt them in their femininity. But they played a vital role in keeping the military functioning on the day-to-day basis. All of those jobs, whether it was with a welder, electrician, or a clerk, or telephone operator, or nurse, or a driver, all of those positions were necessary to keep the military as this large functioning thing working. And they were essential to having that be successful. Black women in WAC, as most women, African American women, were not allowed in the waves, and none were allowed in Wasp. But they were allowed into WAC, although not at the beginning. Initially, it was resisted, and it was only later in the war that they opened it up for Black women. You still had many issues of racial discrimination in terms of jobs and what they could do. Almost all of the jobs were non-skilled labor. And so what, I defined it before as right, the highly skilled, I should have said more highly skilled, like welders or specific skilled jobs, versus clerk and secretary and telephone operator were still skilled jobs you had to learn. But these tended to be more the Army defined as non-skilled labor, and with that, these were seen as menial jobs, which were largely regulated to dishes, food service. There were some nurses, which would not be a non-skilled job, right? So that it did vary, but it certainly was far less training and skilled jobs compared to what white women had within WAC. They were only allowed to, with nurses, treat Black men and prisoners of war. So you still had a segregation of who they were allowed to help, and you had a segregation in the units as well, both in the units for working and living. There also was a far less recognition during and after the war. This is some of, and this goes for Black soldiers as well, male soldiers. within World War II. And one of the things that's going to happen is when the civil rights movement takes place, part of that push, there's lots of components to it, but part of that push was the participation within the war, and many soldiers saying like, hey, I fought in World War II, I fought for my country, and now I'm being denied the services that other white soldiers, male soldiers, are getting, such as programs for loans for homes, money to go to college, and that's being denied me, let alone a lack of recognition. Well, white soldiers and women were again still had to have this constant dichotomy and push, that men didn't have to deal with, but both were still hailed as heroes after the war. Black soldiers, both men and women, were largely ignored and kind of just shuttered off to the side, as either completely ignored or ambivalent about their role within the military. And this has a direct result on pushing for civil rights, at least one of the many pieces of saying, like, that we deserve to be recognized within this structure. Okay, the Wasp. I said I wanted to talk about the Wasp just because it's unique. So we are on F here. The Wasp was a controversial program from the beginning because it was for the Air Force. It was for pilots, and pilots was definitely seen as not just a male job, a high status male job, right? For commercial pilots, it was commercial pilots were well paid, and it was seen as a not only a high skill, but something that was this status symbol to be a pilot. And so many of the commercial pilots were threatened by women participating in this program, because their argument was, which to a degree might have happened with it, but because anytime there's like a feminizing of jobs, where job transitions to be more female than male, the status and pay usually goes down. They often call them pink jobs. Well, we do now. There's a title with it. So, for example, a good example of that is nursing. Nursing used to be seen as a male-dominated force. It eventually transitioned to almost entirely a female job. And with that, the prestige and pay dropped significantly. And so their argument is that if this became accepted and women could be part of the general accepted pilots that then could get jobs within the commercial world of flying airplanes, that the prestige and pay would go down. And so you had these men that were actively protesting this program. And eventually, because of this, it does shut down early. They get the military, the Air Force, to close out the program before the war is over. And because of this, the women do not get a lot of recognition for what they did. Now, this had a high interest in it. The applicant pool, as I mentioned, was 25,000 women, and they only accepted 1,074. It had high requirements. In fact, it had higher requirements than they did for men in the Air Force that wanted to become pilots. So higher than men in the Air Force. What they required is that you already had your pilot's license, which was hard to do for women anyway. which is why compared to like 100,000, 140,000, you only had 25,000 applicants. But that's very impressive as it is for how many women had already had their pilot's license, and they already had to have experience. So you couldn't have just gone out and got your pilot's license and then applied. You had to show that you had years of experience flying airplanes. So again, a much higher standard than the men in that wanted to be pilots in the Air Force. Now, what they did is that they did a variety of jobs within the Air Force. One was to actually test planes. So whether that was one that after it had been repaired, occasionally new types of planes, a lot of it was after repairs and making sure that they were acceptable. They did a lot they ferried planes to different locations. So if they needed to bring in a plane to a new area, but they didn't have, they weren't transporting troops, then you would often have a woman that would fly the plane to the new location. They also participated in maneuver training to help practice the male pilots. They also ferried in supplies. And now, while they were not combat fighters and they were not directly fighting in combat, or often they weren't bringing over large troop forces, you did have 38 women who lost their lives, that died doing their job during the period they served. So it was not like there wasn't some danger to it, especially when you think about like testing planes. And occasionally if you were ferrying planes into dangerous areas, you could get shot down. So there was significant danger to this, even though they didn't directly participate in combat. And so then, like I said, it was because of pressure from civilian male pilots and veteran groups, it ends up getting shut down, and they were not eligible for veterans benefits until 1977, when Congress passed an act to recognize them. So that therein lies some of the danger of compared to WAC, when you are not officially recognized as part of the military, is that WAC, women in WAC got veteran benefits. The other groups did not, because they weren't officially part of the military. And you didn't get pay for injury and death that you could get disability pay for as part of the official thing. So there's a lot of important reasons besides just recognition and acknowledgement of their work to be participating or to be given official positions within the military. Nonetheless, all of this was incredibly important for moving it forward for women to be able to be in the military in the future. Let alone just, again, World War II really being this recognition of that women could participate in these jobs and in society in ways that had traditionally been seen reserved for men. And that definitely was a huge boost on women's rights, women seeing themselves as being capable. And having opportunities. Of course, there's going to be pushback in the 1950s with the suburban housewife, but it's no coincidence that when you have the civil rights movement, you also have the women's rights movement that emerges as well, because of the memories and connections, both from then younger women's mothers who participated in this, and women directly who participated in this, and the workforce numbers never go to pre-war levels, both within the war industry and women being interested in participating in other areas in the workforce and the military that had not been previously opened up to them. So it had a long-term consequence for women in society and the type of jobs, what women could do, opportunities that hadn't existed prior to that. All right, so what we're going to switch to and looking at now is the Japanese internment camps and what was going on there. Oh, let me show you. I forget the few PowerPoints I have with this one, which just shows the women within doing training and uniform. Of course, right, the uniform is not practical. They still had to wear long skirts. And in part, that was the clear idea of, right, that they were not participating in warfare. You didn't need to have pants because you weren't going to participate in that. Although it reminds me of during World War II, you have when they had to shut down Major League Baseball because they didn't have enough men to play during World War II, and along with some other issues that were going on within that time, but a lot of it had to do with just the availability of men because of the draft. They had a women's league. And they played baseball within this kind of major league women's league to try to keep fans coming and make some revenue. And the same thing, the expectation is that women would do this, but then they would stop when the men came back. And they also, the uniforms that they had the women play baseball in were skirts as well. Shorter skirts than this, but skirts. So there's still that expectation of femininity. I mean, if they had the women wearing pants in the military uniform, I think people would have lost their minds about how women were all turning into men, apparently, within that process. And then here, just another one shows women hanging out with the patches and stuff, and just the official uniform, which again was that key important component of it, is that they had military rank. And they were officially part of the military. I mean, here you can see the designated ranks and insignia along with different units that they were assigned to. And then here you have African American Women's Army Corps. And that was part of it, is that the WAC designated a separate Army Corps name for Black women, that they were as African American Women's Army Corps, that they didn't even enroll them and put them into the same WAC for where white women went to, but that they did allow them to participate at the end of the war was still again a kind of a catalyst for the civil rights movement of saying, we participated, we were part of this, we deserve to be recognized. And so that was a helpful movement, not so much of what the Army did, but what it allowed women to begin pushing for, as well as the men that served. And then here is a picture of women who were part of the Wasp group and pilots. And this was, again, one of the more controversial ones out of all of them, even though they all had issues, because of how masculine of a role and high status this was. And I think that plays into it when you look at their dress, right? It's far less feminine than these here, right? This one, and even here with the skirts, right? You aren't going to be working on a plane, flying a plane in a skirt. You have on the jumpsuit, and they have the bomber jackets. And so this type of very masculine look definitely played a role, besides, again, as I mentioned, the high status and pay of the job itself. Not for the women in WASP, but for men, and not wanting to lose that to women. But I think the picture shows a good contrast between how they were still trying to feminize WAC, where with WASP that wasn't happening just because it was impractical, and that definitely played a role within images and ideas of that position as well. Okay, so what we're going to look at next is just Japanese internment camps, and what went on there within the U.S. And the loss of civil rights, and really just overall horrible treatment of Japanese Americans. So Pearl Harbor, because of Pearl Harbor, there was an immediate belief that Japanese Americans were potentially going to be traitors, that they were going to provide information to Japan. And so that fear and disbelief, and not disbelief, misbelief in really racist ideology of that just because you were had some you were of Japanese descent, that meant you automatically were somehow loyal to Japan, led to several acts that eventually led to removal of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. So from the beginning, Pearl Harbor created this sense of fear, and increased just racist ideas. And so from the beginning, you had both politicians and organizations. There were individuals as well, but there were these organizations that called themselves patriotic groups. There are different groups that usually were connected to patriotic organizations, as they called themselves, called for first what they called for was limits on freedom and movement, and then eventually calls for removal. So what happens is that the first act was in December of 1941. The federal government froze financial assets of those born in Japan. So they didn't start with Japanese Americans first, or Japanese Americans born in the United States. Instead, they focused on those born in Japan. And so you could still be a Japanese American, but if you were born in Japan, then your financial assets were frozen. And the idea behind this, or the reasoning, was the belief that if they didn't have access to their finances, then they couldn't either move around the country and gain information, spy, and send it on, and or fly to Japan with that information. And so that was the first step. The next thing you had was an increase in racist talk. Is racist talk and publications. It was a huge movement with the newspapers. You did have columns and things like that. There was some radio programs as well. And what they started doing was essentially dehumanizing Japanese Americans. And in part that came from being at war with Japan. And the other part was just, of course, the racist ideology that was already present within the United States. And so they started using derogatory slang against Japanese in headlines for newspapers. You had racist cartoons, political cartoons that were published. We'll say racist slang. There were also just blatant racial stereotypes that began to be spread, as well as actually news articles, not just opinion articles, that connected this idea that the Japanese Americans were secretly spying for Japan. This created an increase in fear and fervor around the idea that they needed to do something to prevent Japan getting whatever secret information Japanese Americans were going to give them. Of course, there was no connection to what the baker, the whatever job these people are doing that has nothing to do with secrets whatsoever. What secrets were they even going to share? But that's what happened with this irrational fear, but then the racist component that was already clearly present within the United States that led to this not even looking logically at what supposedly people were going to give to Japan. Where they lived. I mean, yeah, there's no connection to it because there wasn't. So then on February 19th of 1942, the United States suspended the civil liberties and civil rights of Japanese Americans. And they did so by requiring the removal of anyone with Japanese ancestry, American citizen or not. What they decided to do, and again, this was only on the West Coast because that was the closer connection to Japan. And interestingly not, where there was a larger Japanese population in Hawaii, it didn't happen there. In part because they made up a significant portion of the economy, and removal could have devastated the economy there. So in Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor happened, you didn't have removal, but on the West Coast you did. So over 110,000 men, women, and children were told to report to different locations along the West Coast to be moved to camps. And they were given a 1 week notice for some to pack up and sell belongings. In some cases, they were only given a couple days, which of course is not going to allow you to be able to realistically do anything with your property at all. What this led to was that, one, you actually had the government that actively confiscated personal property. So in some cases, they went in and took the personal property. The government did it itself. The army actively rounded up people that were resisting or not moving fast enough. In some areas, they just sent the army to get people. They were only allowed to take one bag with them or one suitcase. So everything else you had to leave behind. But of course, you couldn't just leave your stuff there. So this led to a couple things. There were attempts to protect or sell property. It depended on whether they knew someone that they could have watch their property. So in some cases, they tried to have friends take over their property and possessions with the hope that they would get it back from them when this was over. Now, occasionally that worked. A lot of times what happened is that the so-called, right, we'll put in quotations now, friend kept the property or sold it. And so when they came back from the camps, when everything was over, they had lost all their property because this friend it just was like, nope, it's mine now, because they had to sign it over to them to make it legal. Because if you otherwise the government could take their property if they just left it. And so they'd signed it over to the friend with the agreement that the friend would hold on to it, keep an eye on it, or business, right? A lot of them lost businesses this way because, yes, someone could do with a house, but the business were especially stolen, we'll say, because then the friend would just take over and run the business, and then say it's my business now when they came back. But personal property, homes, things like that were lost as well. They also then tried to have selling the business, property, and belongings, right? Everything inside your house. And the majority of the time, because everyone was aware that they had to sell this stuff, they made almost nothing on it. For example, a house could go for a couple $100s. Someone was saying their refrigerator went for $5. And so people just took advantage. Other times, people just straight up stole their stuff. So the reality is that the majority of Japanese Americans that ended up being taken to these internment camps lost everything. Whether they were swindled out of it, whether they were it was stolen, whether a trusted friend ended up not being such a trusted friend. The places, the communities they lived, the communities they worked, took advantage and treated them incredibly poorly, not only with screaming and yelling at them and putting up signs. There were big, huge signs that said that they had to go, you're not wanted here, and then just to lose everything this way was just horrendous, let alone the feeling of betrayal that your country deems you not fully American, right? They basically were treated as you're not really American, and not only are you not really American, but we think you're a traitor as well. And many said that psychologically that was just devastating in of itself. And many kids who had grown up American felt utterly betrayed by that situation, by the government, and then again by the people in the community around them, that instead of rallying around them and making sure to help them out and protect their stuff or protest against this, that none of that happened. It was a large support for this. Now there were some people that left rather than left, because basically, like I said, outside of the West Coast areas, states around there, this wasn't happening. It was very much a West Coast thing. And so there were people who moved away rather than be put into internment camps. But that still required a very quick leaving, often losing your property in the process too. So even those who didn't end up in the internment camps because they moved away found that they were in a position where they weren't able to do anything but kind of give up their possessions, minus whatever they could maybe fit in a car, which I guess was more than what people going to the internment camps had. But nonetheless, you weren't going to get a better sale on your house just because you chose to move away rather than go with the removal that took place. And so you had, let's put here, the camps themselves and what was going on there. There were 10 internment camps, although initially not all were complete when they started moving the Japanese Americans to these camps. So many ended up going into these half-done, almost not done camps or waiting stations. And that was also another part of it, is that you did have, which were essentially transportation or what would it be, like a way station. And so they had temporary locations, and then eventually the final camp location. So many didn't go straight to the camp because it wasn't fully built. And even then, when they did get to the camp, it wasn't fully built. We should put that under there too. they actually made them help build the camps. So they had a few buildings, but a lot of it was incomplete. And so the people that were in the camps themselves actually ended up building and constructing and expanding the camps. So you had places in California, Utah, Colorado, and Arkansas of where they were taken. And we can look at the map in just a second with that. The life in the camps was difficult. And certainly there was, when you first arrived, you were processed, and then you were expected to sign a loyalty. It's not sing. Sign a loyalty. Agreement that you know, declared your loyalty to the United States. And there were some people who refused to do that, others who threatened and said, like, I'm an American citizen, this is illegal, and they didn't care. In fact, one person who tried to leave, they ended up shooting him. So you had a fence and barbed wire. There were guards, right, that did not let you leave. You were a prisoner. I cannot write today. And they would shoot if you tried to leave. So it definitely was not this, oh, we're just, you're free to kind of go around wherever. One of the things is that most were located in the desert, which of course you have high temperatures, and there wasn't any type of good insulation or buildings initially or even later. The meals were meager at best, and in some cases when they first arrived, there was a lack of food at the start. There was one case of a woman who had a 10-day-old baby, and she needed formula because she couldn't produce milk. So a 10-day-old baby, and they didn't give her formula. And so she had to... basically she gave their baby water for the first 10 days because she couldn't get anything from the guards or the people running the camp. So couldn't get any formula and had to give water. So then when she finally got formula and was seen by the doctor, the doctor told her she was a bad mom because she wasn't taking care of her baby, even though they were the ones that weren't, that, you know, the lucky that the baby didn't die from not getting any nutrition. And then you had others who did die from either the medical conditions that were not treated, was definitely a common aspect of an inadequate medical care, and general lack of a good diet and food and things like that. And so there was poor medical treatment, poor food, and then those who resisted were killed or tried to leave. They did try to make life as normal as possible for the kids. Attempts, we'll see, at normalcy. So one of the things that many people did once they were in the camps is that they tried to divide people up into jobs. Now, this was not done by the American soldiers or the government. This was the Japanese Americans that were in the camp themselves, and said, you know what, we're going to create jobs. We're going to have positions for people based on what their skills were. And so one of those was education of the children, and creating schools and teachers. And so they had they created classes for the kids to go to school every day so that they could continue being educated while they were in the camps. They also had storekeepers, store clerks, who would help with food division. And they paid people based on what they could round up, whether that was food, money, clothing. You had tailors. And so they created this like mini society within the camps, as best as they could, both with actually physically creating the homes, but then within community and society, of maintaining a sense of normalcy, as well as there was definitely an attempt to maintain culture and values during that time as well, having older generation share their stories, connect to their culture, and refuse to get rid of one to try to claim the other, and instead see them as both equally valuable. So a lot of resiliency with the people that were in the camps. One of the things is that the army did is that they went around to younger men and offered them that they could get out of the camps if they signed up as a soldier. Of course, they weren't sent to the Pacific, but to the Western Front. But it's almost like an added insult to injury, that like, we don't trust you, we aren't treating you as an American citizen, but we're desperate for soldiers, so if you want to be a soldier, that's how you get out of the camp. Some chose that. A lot, again, saw it as an insult. And by August, though, virtually everyone on the West Coast that was of Japanese American descent was interned. There was one man who refused. Fred was his name, and he actually took it to the Supreme Court and said that this was illegal. So you do have an attempt at a Supreme Court fight, and specifically arguing, of course, that this was an illegal action, and that he was under no obligation to be removed or go to the camps. Ultimately, he lost, which again shows the state. The argument, of course, was in extreme and measures and what could be seen as a losing of civil rights were sometimes necessary in war. You did have one judge that did write a dissent that talked about the dangers of what they were doing, but the majority of the American population supported this and didn't necessarily see anything wrong. But it does highlight the problems of what happens when you are willing to give up civil liberties and rights because of fear, and especially when that's done on a targeted population based on race, religion, ideology. You should always be paying attention. If there's ever a group that's singled out and their civil rights and liberties suspended based on a possibility because of fear, it's problematic and illegal on top of that. But of course, you get around the illegality of it because it's connected to the idea of wartime necessity. But that's always ultimately a problem within that. After the war, the internment camps end. and people are allowed to go home, but of course home to often nothing, because all of their property and life was stolen away. Many weren't wanting to go back to the community that they lived in either, because they felt betrayed by that, let alone having to start over. And most had to start over from nothing. On top of that, you don't have actual official recognition or apology until the Clinton era. And then there was a small amount of compensation for survivors or relatives of survivors, but right, that didn't help the people at the time, and it still wasn't, you know, anywhere near close enough to the circumstances of what happened. But it shows you how long that was either seen as acceptable or attempted to be kind of pushed under the rug and ignored as something that the United States did. Okay, the last thing that we're going to look at is the use of the atomic bombs, and the decisions that went into that, and the consequences of that. So one of the things that plays a role in that, of course, was the Pacific War. And what we talked about already with this, the brutality, the struggle and deaths, that you had this start, and we'll say still going on after Germany's defeat. So you had the Pacific War start, and then the Western War starts, or the Western Front, and then that ends, Germany's defeated, and the Pacific fighting is still going on. And so there was a massive discussion on how to end the war, and you know, what was the best course of action to save American lives, what was actually going to get the Japanese to surrender, because that was that samurai mentality of not surrendering. And there was concern and fear of what was actually going to get them to surrender, what was going to officially end the war, to that they wanted to save American lives. There also, of course, was concern with Russia's involvement, and both the one that they could help, but two, Stalin had a very different idea of, let's say, desire for territory. Remember, by World War I and the Versailles Treaty, people weren't taking land exactly in the same way, right? You conquer an area, it didn't automatically become yours. And even more so with World War II. However, Stalin saw it differently and believed that they got territory that they conquered, that they could use and expand into the Soviet Union. As well as, of course, there were already tensions between Russia and the US because of the Nazi-Soviet pact. All of this then, and then we'll put the other one, which was that they could help end the war. So there was acknowledgement that they could play a role in that. But those were all things that then came up as questions for what's the best way to save American lives, what was going to happen, how was it going to make Japanese surrender, Russia's involvement, and then the overall, well, it was saving American lives, I guess that would go with the casualties. There was a lot of concentration on this being a long, protracted war that was going to continue to play out, and that there would be a lot more American lives that would be lost. And so there definitely was a huge discussion that took place on that. At the same time, you had the development of atomic weapons that were being created during the war, in an attempt to create a weapon that would be so devastating that it could successfully change or alter the course of a war. And so, like I said, that became then, let's see, we'll actually put this with 4, with the following options for war. Right, from all of these considerations, there was then the idea of what are the ways that we can do this. The first was continue with the current mode of attack, right? And that included aerial bombing, not with atomic bombs, but just carpet bombing and barraging them with bombs, and then land invasion. So let's put that on there with that. So we have that connection, bombing and land invasion. So that was what had been going on through the various islands, and saying continuing with that plan of attack. The other was to increase bombing attacks. So step it up and just bomb even more with regular conventional bombs still. And then you had that allowing Russia to join in. And then finally, with the development, once the president got word that the successful tests and trials of the atomic bomb had been created, using the atomic bomb to try to end the war, right? And all of these were discussed. There wasn't like there was immediately one specific answer. They were all discussed. And ultimately the realization of what the first two options were is that it wouldn't necessarily, they couldn't guarantee that this would cause a surrender. No, for sure bet that Japan would surrender. And there was considerable fear that because of the mentality of the Japanese, that you could continue with this devastating move and it would just be a continued long drawn out war with massive American casualties. And the other, of course, argument was that if Russia got involved, then they could start demanding more territory. And so that also created what we see with Russia was this idea of speeding up the decision in many ways. For fear of because they didn't want Russia to join in. Well, and it was weird because there was a desire for Russia to join in at first. And then as time went on, there was a lot of pushback saying it's not a good idea for Russia to join in because Stalin's going to push for all of this stuff. So we really need to end the war before Russia gets overly involved, because as they start committing and sending in troops, then we're going to find ourselves having to deal with Stalin demanding more territory and involvement in policy making in Japan. So that you have this dichotomy, because there was an argument, okay, we could use Russia against the Japanese to force them to surrender, because they're not going to want Russia in Japan. But if you have a choice between Russia coming in and helping and conquering you, or the United States conquering you, the United States was a much better option. Russia was brutal when they went in. There was definitely killings and rapes and stealing and theft that took place when Russia conquered and took over an area. So between the two, the United States was the better option. So that was floated first, that we'll use Russia as a motivator. But then at the same time, if that failed, now you have to deal with Russia actually being involved and demanding things when the war is finally over, versus only having to deal with them within Europe. And so that, like I said, I think kind of pushed up the timetable, along with, again, the concern of American lives, and the general belief that Japan wasn't going to surrender ever. And so only something that was so utterly devastating it would bring them to their knees and force them to capitulate. Which is why ultimately, and we're gonna look at the documents in just a second that kind of talk about some of those ideas, because they definitely did. There were other ideas to consider. Right, the use of the atomic bombs was not the only option, and I mentioned some of the options here, but we're going to see it in the sources as well, and that there were scientists who said we really shouldn't be using this weapon. It's a bad idea. Ultimately, because of these concerns and fears and stuff that was going on, though, right, they decided Actually what they did is they gave Japan one more chance to surrender, and they refused. And that was on August 3rd, 1945. Japan refused to surrender. Now, one of the things that's talked about is that there was a huge discussion about the emperor and abdication or not. And many argue that Japan would never surrender if the emperor was forced to abdicate. And so the U.S., so you had the term unconditional surrender. And within that term, there's a lot that's going on with that. And some of it is the idea that meant the emperor. So the United States tried one last time where they tried to give a way out to Japan that would give them room to keep their emperor. This didn't work. There's several different speculations for that. One was that the language they used convinced the Japanese that the Americans' force wasn't as strong as they thought it was going to be, and they were looking for a way out. Others who thought it was a weakening position. Nonetheless, instead of helping, it didn't. The other argument, of course, is that they were not the U.S. We specific on who we're talking about here. The U.S. was not clear about the atomic bomb. And now we're going to look at a document in a minute that suggests they themselves were not clear about the atomic bomb and the devastation. It came, the warnings, because they did give warnings. They did give warnings to the cities they were going to bomb. Well, especially Hiroshima. They dropped leaflets on the city, warning them. But the warning was just, it was described as this extra large bomb. Well, Hiroshima and Japan in general had been bombed a ton. So they were used to constant air raids, bombings, things like that. The leaflets told them they should evacuate the city. But if you don't fully describe what the bomb was, which again, there's evidence that the United States knew of its physical destructive power, but not the radiation component, not to the level that it was. But even then, they didn't do a good job of describing the physical devastation this bomb was going to, which they knew. They definitely knew the physical devastation of the explosive nature of the bomb. But again, we'll see, not the radiation component to its extreme. Nonetheless, they didn't describe that well even. And so if you're constantly being bombed and air raided anyways, they're like, what's the difference from what you've been doing for like the last several months? You know, and so it wasn't taken seriously. And that, you know, translation, clear descriptive of what they were doing. And some argument too is that they didn't want to warn them completely because they didn't want them to know what they had. So then you have this weird, we need to warn, but we don't want to describe it too fully. So we're going to just say really large bomb. But that meant nothing in terms of, like I said, the constant bombing that Hiroshima and then later Nagasaki we're dealing with. So that's what you had, is that after the refusal to surrender, they send out leaflets and warnings, and they decide on the first target to be Hiroshima. Is the first target. And there was a lot of different discussion over which city should be the target. There was some talk of the capital for a while, but then ultimately the president decided that he didn't want the capital with the buildings and the culture destroyed there. Others argued for Hiroshima because it had some military targets that could be, because you had to justify it in terms of that you had military tactical meaning, that you weren't just dumping a massive bomb on civilians for the sake of killing civilians. Nonetheless, it destroyed the city and it destroyed civilians. It wasn't a target attack on just a military installations. It targeted the entire city, but that was the justification for it. So the first bomb then was dropped on Hiroshima, and instantly you had over 40,000 people die, and they were just completely, in some cases evaporated. We'll look at a picture. I forgot to show the Japanese internment camps, so we'll look at those and the atomic bombs together. You have what was called these shadows, where the people were just disintegrated from the heat and the force, and because it was such a fast, rapid heat, what was left was a blackened shadow of where they had been. And so massive death just in that, and it leveled buildings all over the place. And then the following weeks, you had over 100,000 people die from radiation poisoning and burns. And we'll see the radiation was the U.S. was surprised about. The burns, that was more expected, but the radiation poisoning wasn't fully understood. By 1950, just to show the long-term consequence of this, the death toll was over 200,000. And then August 14th of 1945, the second bomb was dropped because, which was just a few days after Hiroshima on Nagasaki, and that was because they hadn't surrendered yet, and so the belief was, well, we're going to keep going until they surrender. Bomb was dropped. And then after Nagasaki, you had, it was what, a couple days later, the Japanese surrender. So you certainly can say that it did make them surrender. But one of the arguments with that is that they would have surrendered anyway, and so it was unnecessary. But it was ultimately incredibly destructive. And one of the things that was clear is that scientists understood it better than everyone else within the United States, even the president, the military, when they were doing testing. You had one of these beach. It became known as Bikini Beach. It was Bikini Atoll. Let's put that as a separate. We'll just put it as a separate thing here. So this beach was used for testing, and it was often just called Bikini Beach by the soldiers. And they told the residents, so they moved the residents, the people who live there, that they just needed to relocate for a little bit while they tested. and that not only that they would ultimately be able to move back. There was definitely a lack of understanding that the long-term consequences of the atomic bombs. They picked it because it was remote and had certain conditions that would be beneficial for testing. But again, this idea that we just need you to relocate while we test the bombs, and then when we're done, you can move back. It became uninhabitable, a wasteland, right? So the beach became, but we're still on that one. It became a wasteland with nothing growing, and of course the radiation and everything else. The other thing that showed that there was a lack of understanding about the radiation is that you had American soldiers on the ships that were too close for the testing, and they were exposed to high levels of radiation, and many ended up getting different conditions and also dying from it. So even not understands the point of securing and keeping safe soldiers who were part of those testing phases. And then of course it became a huge discussion. If you're looking at long-term, way too far there. Long-term arguments about consequences and whatnot. Of course, there was discussion of the moral decision, and especially when people realize the devastation, right or wrong, was this something we should have done, even early on discussing that. And then you have the fact that atomic bombs were now part of warfare. And more importantly, what you're going to get to is the arms race, where you have stockpiling of atomic weapons because of the massive and crazy power of these weapons. It's a game changer. And then there's the fear component of it, that if other people have atomic weapons, then you need to have atomic weapons to defend yourself, or at least mutual annihilation. And the idea that neither one will actually, it's a way to prevent people from using it, because if both sides have it, if one uses it, the other will use it on them, and you've destroyed each other. So by using the atomic weapons, you guarantee that your destruction. And that, of course, then also leads to the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Notwithstanding the long-term devastation for Japanese citizens, right? So long-term, we'll say not only devastation of the cities, but medical conditions of the people. Not conditional there. Conditions of Japanese. So all of this played a role within that. So what I want to look at then are the sources. Let's look at before I forget the pictures here, because I keep forgetting to do those. So this just shows a map of the different relocation centers, the internment camps. And so you have temporary centers which were like way stations before going to the ones here in the triangles were the main camps. But all these other dots were places where they were transported to before going to the actual internment camp. Here was a notice that was put up, and did I put another one? No, I didn't put the full one. This is just it's zoomed in. It was this long notice that had all the rules and laws and expectation. These were plastered throughout the city. This is for Los Angeles, and instructing all of them over what they had to do and the rules, and showing up to self-report for removal. So I mean, that's the thing too, right? They like, you have to self-report. to be removed. This is the notice. This is the legal thing. But and so you got all of these signs that overnight were posted. Notwithstanding the legal removal posters, you also had the racist signs that were created to remind them that they were not welcome. And so that you're dealing with it both attacks from the federal government along with individual people all attacking you. Here's a picture with the internment camps where you can see some of the housing that was built, but then you have the fencing and the soldiers that made sure they didn't leave. They were often brought in trains and packed in as well, much like the concentration camps. You know, it mirrors it in many ways. Where you don't go is the mass extermination and active killing of peoples, but the idea of rounding up and putting people in camps, very much similar in that aspect of it. And then here, just another image of life within the internment camps, of setting up daily activities, creating a mini society within the camps to try to, especially for their kids, you know, have life go on and be able to live within that. And then this one is just showing all of these barrack style living quarters. Again, a lot of these were not there when people were first brought in. A lot of these were built or helped to be built by the Japanese Americans that were put into these camps. And then here is just an image of the explosive component of the atomic bomb when it's set off. And then the devastation of Hiroshima. I mean, you can see there, it looks like nothing. There were buildings here and trees and homes. And there's a few remnants of buildings, and but it looks like there never was anything there, which just shows you the insane level of devastation that took place. Here's another one with just these brick buildings, cement buildings being leveled, and then the shadows of people. So these are because of the intense heat of the bomb. You have shadows of where people died. It created and left a shadow, charred shadow of them. But there was nothing else. Well, there were a few cases where there were bodies still left, but there were other cases where there was nothing left but the shadow. And so this kind of haunting image of that was a person. This was a person that was you know, utterly destroyed by this bomb, and these kind of haunting reminders of that death and destruction that took place with the atomic bomb. So the last thing I wanted to look at was just the primary sources. These were all classified documents that eventually became unclassified, that showcases some of the thought and idea that was going on about what options there were outside of the atomic bomb, as well as some reservations about it as well. And so this one was recommendation for immediate use of nuclear weapons. They do suggest here, though, that they notify people, the allies, I should say, right? So this was like we should not just use this without telling Britain, Russia, and France and China that we're going to be doing this. And then it does. There's going to be several that talk about the scientist, and that the scientists don't agree. There were several that said that they shouldn't use it. So it says the opinions of our scientist colleagues on the initial use of these weapons are not unanimous. They range from the proposal of a purely technical demonstration. So that was one argument. Instead of actually using it on a city, how about we just show them how utterly devastating this is? That might induce surrender in of itself. And then at least you have the moral high ground of not mass murdering people and killing people at such an extreme level and just devastating a city. Let's show how horrible it is and see if they'll surrender first. And then many scientists said it, and then we'll feel better about if you have to use it as the only way to get them to surrender. But you don't understand the devastation of this by description, which is exactly what happened. Those leaflets meant nothing. And so that was one option for an alternative, was that technical demonstration. Those who advocated purely technical demonstration would wish to outlaw the use of atomic weapons and have feared that if we use weapons now, our position in future negotiations will be prejudiced. Others emphasized the opportunity of saving American lives by immediate military use. So you can see you have immediate use, and it saves American lives. So even in this, there's talk about different tactics, right? Notify allies, technical demonstration, immediate use. And then this one was a meeting that was held by a variety of people within the White House, and they're kind of sharing their ideas, positions, talking about invasion into Japan, cost of lives. Right, so here our air and sea power has already greatly reduced movement of Japanese shipping south of Korea, and should in the next few months out to a trickle, if not a choke, off entirely. Hence, there's no need for seizing further positions in order to block Japan's communications. So this is suggesting that they're already winning. And it looks like there isn't, that if they just keep going with the strategy that they had, that it would eventually end, right? And then it says, our estimates that our air action will have smashed practically every industrial target worth hitting in Japan, as well as destroying huge areas in the Japanese cities. The Japanese Navy, if any still exist, will be completely powerless. Our sea action and air power will have cut Japanese reinforcement capabilities from the mainland to negligible proportions. So again, this idea of that the devastation of Japan and Japanese fighting forces was already underway, which could be used with the question with the discussion board about like alternative options and things that way. It seems that if the Japanese are ever willing to capitulate short of complete military defeat in the field, they will do it when faced by a completely hopeless prospect. You know, this one says the entry or threat of the entry of Russia into the war, which was another idea floating. Well, would the threat of Russia coming into the war be enough to get them to, you know, capitulate? It also talks about air bombardment and sea blockade, some of the normal stuff they're doing. They go into casualties. One of the big things that you notice in here is that the president is saying he doesn't want another Okinawa, right? The Iwo Jima and Okinawa were bloody, difficult wars with lots of American lives lost, battles lost. And so he says, like, I don't want this to continue being more Okinawas. Like, how can we do this without having killing so many Americans? And they, you know, they say, well, we don't think it has to be that bad, but it is a grim fact that there is not an easy, bloodless way to victory in war, and it is the thankless task of the leaders to maintain their firm outward front which holds the resolution of their subordinates. And so before you have it's one of the reasons why, the atomic bomb was appealing, because it did create an easy, bloodless for American solution once it came to be an option, right? The whole thing that they're saying here makes that an option, and it's understandably super appealing route if you don't kind of consider the devastation and the moral grounds of dropping it on civilians. And that's justified through war and the idea of it being an enemy, right? An important point about Russian participation in the war is that the impact of Russian entry on the already hopeless Japanese may well be the decisive action levering them into capitulation. So again, talking about Japan. Then Marshall says, the General Marshall says he felt that air power alone was not sufficient to put the Japanese out of the war. So then that was arguing, of course, the case that and that was an argument too. We can keep bombing them; it's not going to make them surrender. Anyway, this is kind of goes into it shows them the thinking that's going on. the different options, what they're trying to come up with ways, what's the best way, what's the possibility of this working. Then there was another one that said he thought that there was a group of Japanese who didn't support the war, or at least didn't support it anymore. And he was hoping that what he could do is maybe get them to push back against the emperor and the government and get them to surrender. The president says, well, wouldn't us invading, he asked if the invasion of Japan by white men would not have the effect of a more closely uniting the Japanese. Right, so then it's like, well, but if we invade, then isn't that just going to unite them? And so then there was arguments about that. Anyways, this one is really good at showing just how many different things and ideas and discussions were going on. This one's with the scientists. Many of the scientists who have been working on the program have expressed considerable concern about the future dangers of the development of the atomic power. Some are fearful that no safe system of international control can be established, right? So that's the idea of, it's like, once you release this, it's free game for everyone. And, that is such a huge problem we're going to have to deal with. And the possibility of, right, that it could threaten civilization, right? That they were concerned and were fearful that they could destroy the world. And it wasn't a completely unreasonable threat at the time of, like, what are we releasing on the world? This is a horrible idea. One group of scientists working in the Chicago laboratories urges that we should not make use of the bomb. So that was another option, right? Not make use of the bomb. Remember the question, right? What were the different alternatives? So don't use the atomic bomb. So nearly complete against any enemy country at this time. They feel that to do so might sacrifice the whole moral position and thus make it more difficult for us to be leaders in proposing or enforcing any system of international control designed to make this tremendous force and influence towards maintenance of world peace rather than a weapon of war. So that was the other argument, is that the atomic bomb should be a weapon of peace and not to be used. The idea is that the threat of the destruction would lead to peace, but it could also be made into a weapon of war. And if you use it to have Japan surrender, you're using it as a weapon of war, not a weapon of peace. Even if it leads to peace, it's not a weapon of peace. It's a weapon of war. And then that the consequences right around the world. Accordingly, most of them believe that that one of the effective steps in establishing such a control is the assurance that after the war is over, there shall be a free interchange of scientific opinion throughout the world, supplemented if possible by systems of inspection. So say we're going to give them the information and let people know about it, but in order, there has to be rules of inspection. And they also said that we should briefly advise the Russians of our progress. So that was interesting too, right? You have both a fear of Russia coming in and getting involved, but there were several arguments of, we have to inform Russia though. The president actually does, like, right before, in kind of vague terms. The funny thing is that Russia was working on their own weapons, so they both were like, oh yeah, like slyly, like, I'm going to vaguely give you information about this because I think you don't know what we're talking about. And the Russians are like, we know what you're talking about, and we're going to give you vague information and not really sure that we're close to finishing our own. So they're each playing each other, not realizing that the other has knowledge about certain things in that process. But it's interesting because you have several arguments in here that Russia should be told. And at the same time, well, we really don't want Russia involved. And where that is. So yeah, the president ends up telling them very vaguely right before we use it. And this one, ever since I have been in touch with this program, I have had a feeling that before the bomb is actually used against Japan, that Japan should have some preliminary warning for say 2 or 3 days in advance of use. I also have the feeling very definitely that the Japanese government may be searching for some opportunities for which they could use as a medium of surrender. So this was also an argument that Japan was looking to surrender. And the atomic weapon was not necessary. They just had to find a way to have the right conditions for which they would. And then this one is that Japan gets a warning. And again, the argument was that their solution for that, or their situation for that was the leaflets. However, that wasn't a really good warning, but that's what this one's arguing. Here you have, we feel, however, that such attacks on Japan could not be justified, at least not unless the terms with which will be imposed after the war on Japan were made public in detail and Japan was given an opportunity to surrender. Such a step, however, ought not to be made at any time without seriously considering the moral responsibilities that are involved. So you hear a lot about the moral responsibilities that are brought up. What is our moral obligation of using this weapon? Which shows you, again, there's this divide between how serious they were taking it, but also not fully understanding it was even worse than they thought with the radiation component and how much it just made everything lifeless and destroyed not only people, but the plants and animals and being able to live in those places. Notwithstanding the radiation poisoning, people, they were just, this was all, a lot of this concern was connected just to the physical force of the bomb. Now the scientists understood better, but even they didn't fully understand to the exact level of devastation, and yet there's so much concern for this moral obligation of what they're doing. And then again, the idea of giving them warnings, letting them know, like, here's what we were wanting to do at the end of the war, and how, like, we're not just going to say unconditional surrender. Here's what we outlined for what would happen with surrender, because they thought that maybe if they had a better understanding of here's what the steps we're okay with, you know, that, or saying like the emperor, we won't get rid of the emperor, but you are going to have to do this, this, and this, maybe they would surrender first, and clearly telling them about the bomb. That's what the scientists meant, not dropping leaflets that were vague references to bigger bombs, but specifically sharing the devastation of what this bomb was going to do. Fair warning, not, I don't know, fake warning, half-baked warning, in terms of fair warning to them. The development of atomic power will provide the nations with a new means of destruction. The atomic bomb at our disposal represent only the first step in this direction, right? So that, again, the fear of the consequences of using this weapon. There's almost no limit to the destructive power from which we'll be able from the future development. In the view of the foregoing, we, the undersigned, respectfully petition, first, that you exercise your power as Commander-in-Chief to rule the United States shall not resort to the use of the atomic bombs in this war unless the terms which will be imposed upon Japan have been made public in detail, and Japan, knowing these terms, has refused to surrender. Second, that in such an event, the question whether or not to use the atomic bombs to be decided by you in the light of the considerations presented in this petition, as well as all other moral responsibilities which are involved. So it's just saying you need to, as a president and commander-in-chief, you need to make the ultimate decision. But there's, again, the idea of, would rather you not use it, and only if you've given Japan options, you've clearly laid out what the end goal plan for them is once they surrender, and tell them about the bomb, which we really did. Again, we did not tell them about the bomb. Now, this one is important because these are doctors talking. No, these are generals, maybe doctors too, that are talking after the bombs have been used. And what this shows is they did not understand the level of radiation poisoning and complications that were going to come from it. They actually think the reports, which are coming from American soldiers, are propaganda that the Japanese put out for sympathy and that the American soldiers bought, even though they were experiencing it firsthand and seeing it. So this one's super important because it does show, again, while there was understanding of the destructive nature of the atomic bomb, not everyone understood the full repercussions of the radiation component to it. There was one, I didn't put it in here, but there was one that actually talked about how they thought the rain would make it go away. Oh yeah, the rain, once it rains in 3 to 5 days, that will wash away the radiation. So in this one, which fatally burned 30,000 victims during the first 2 weeks following its explosion. Ultraviolet, is that the word? Yes, that's kind of crazy. Of course it's crazy. A doctor like me can tell that. Okay, so I guess it's a general and a doctor, colonel. One of them's a doctor, colonel is the doctor. So it's in the military, but one of them is a doctor. A doctor like me can tell that. The death toll of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the other Japanese city blasted anatomically, is still rising, the broadcast said. Radio Tokyo described Hiroshima as a city of death. 90% of its houses, in which 250,000 had lived, were instantly crushed. I don't understand the 250,000 because it had a much bigger population a number of years ago before the war started, and it was a military city. Now it's peopled by ghost parade, the living doomed to die of radioactivity burns. Let me interrupt you here a minute. I would say this. I think it's good propaganda. The thing is, these people got good thermal burns. So, one, they're saying, oh, that's just propaganda. And then the argument is that it's just thermal burns, not radiation. Right? It's not radiation killing them, or the pain, or the problems, the medical problems. It's propaganda, and it's thermal burns. And this is, one of them is a doctor saying this, right? That's the feeling I have. Let me go on here and give you the rest of the picture. So painful are these injuries that sufferers plead, please kill me. This one also is really good at giving you just how horrible the conditions were after this. The broadcast said, no one ever completely recovers. This has been in our paper too last night. Radioactivity caused by the fission of the uranium used in the atomic bombs is taking a toll of mounting deaths and causing reconstruction workers in Hiroshima to suffer various sicknesses and ill health. So then you have here, this is the first acknowledgement that people who weren't anywhere near the bomb itself when it went off are being exposed after the fact, right? And the fact that there was reconstruction workers sent in after the bomb also shows a lack of understanding of that situation, which was both not only Japanese individuals, but there were American soldiers that were sent in to do stuff as well. They suffer various sicknesses and ill health. You yourself, as far as radioactivity is concerned, it isn't anything immediate. It's a prolonged thing. So that was one of the things. They're saying, no, this is way too fast. Whatever it is, if there was radiation, radioactivity, as they're calling it, that's something we wouldn't see for a long time. So whatever's happening now has to be thermal burns, not radiation issues. Right, I think that they just got a good thermal burn. That's what it is. A lot of these people, first of all, they don't notice it much. You may get burned and you may have a little redness, but in a couple of days, you may have a big blister and a sloughing of the skin, and I think that is what people have. And then they say later, they may, but that's awfully quick, pretty terrifically quick. Of course, it depends. But I wonder if you aren't getting a good dose of propaganda. Of course we're getting a good dose of propaganda due to the idiotic performance of the scientist and another who is also on the project, and the newspapers and the radio wanting news. So here they blame the scientists who were more informed about the radiation. But again, even at the beginning, not as much, because of the fact that they were testing in areas that could be impacting other people. But the scientists, as they continued working on this, understood it the best, even though, again, no one had the full picture of just how devastating this was. But that doesn't negate, again, that even what they did think and what the scientists warned them and what the scientists knew was still really, really bad. But he's blaming the scientist and the newspapers, this is in the US, and the radio for overreaction. Right? It's an overreaction. That's what all this hype and propaganda is. And then they say, well, the Japanese scientists are saying it too. Then he talks about the Geiger counter. It says the fact that the uranium has permeated into the ground has been easily ascertained by using a Geiger counter, and it has been disclosed that the uranium used in the atomic bomb is harmful to human bodies. Then it talks about this, which is just the thing we thought. The majority of injured people receive burns from the ultraviolet rays, and maybe second or third degree burns. And he said, that's why I say it's got to be a thermal burn. Well, of course, any burn is potentially an infected wound. We treat any burn as an infected wound. I think you better get the anti-propagandist out. Did you see about the army men who had received burns on reconstruction? Examination of 33 servicemen, of whom 10 had received burns in reconstruction projects 1 week after the bombing took place, showed those with burns, and it talks about their white counts going down for compared to a healthy man. That's a drastic decrease. What about that? And he says, not bothered by a bit. He says, well, burns would cause that to go down. We are not bothered a bit, excepting for what are they trying to do is create sympathy. So then it's the argument that it's propaganda used to create sympathy. And the sad part is that Americans started them off. Right, and that what you did. You had American reports with this, and so then they're trying to claim, oh, it's just the Japanese trying to get sympathy. The Japanese, who were reported today by Tokyo Radio to have died mysteriously a few days after the atomic bomb blast, probably were the victims of a phenomenon which is well known in the great radiation laboratories of America. That, of course, is what does us the damage. And I would say this: you'll have to get some bigwig to put a counter statement in the paper. One, I mean, it shows one, they aren't taking it seriously. But there's also a lack of understanding. So that does play a role, right? When I'm asking the question of what was the a choice, or even the argument of did the U.S. make the right choice? It's not an easy answer because there's a lot of components that went into it. And, that there was various levels of knowledge about what the atomic bomb's level of destruction was, not just the physical damage, but the long-term radioactive damage, as well as, of course, considering all these different factors. I think it also shows that the president was trying to cover a variety of decisions and options, and listening to people from all different positions talk about what they thought should be done. And then also that the scientists clearly understood something serious was wrong with this type of weapon, and from by far the most who urged the president not to do this were the scientists. They're like, we what did we create? And we shouldn't have. Some argued they shouldn't. There were some scientists who argued that it should be used in order to save American lives. So there is no easy answer. There's a lot of different arguments and a lot of different reasons and a lot of different options that were discussed and looked at. And this is only, there's hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of documents that were unclassified, and they all cover all of this stuff. I only picked a select few, but you could deep dive into this for months, looking at all the different discussions and arguments and debates and ideas that went into this. It wasn't something that was spur of the moment, and there definitely was a lot of differing of opinions of what should be done. But I think it is interesting and worth looking into to a degree, or at least acknowledging that there was a lot going on, because it was such a devastating and destructive force that killed so many civilians. And that certainly is a component of total war, which World War I, but even more World War II developed. World War I had it to a degree in small areas and pockets. World War II really was a component of total war, where it's not just about the soldiers fighting, but civilians get brought into this with the air raids, which killed hundreds of thousands of people across the world, that were just regular bombs, but that had a level of destructiveness in a variety of ways, of physical, of the economy, of just the terror it caused, let alone the Holocaust, the internment camps, the gulags with Stalin, that you have all these atrocities that took place in suspending civil rights and liberties, murdering people and civilians. That is definitely a characteristic and quality of World War II, is that it moved into this realm of total war where targeting civilians was acceptable. And almost a necessary part of winning the war. And while there had been total war in the past, during the Civil War, Sherman's March was a practice in total warfare. The level of destruction and death of total warfare was far greater during World War II. And then also, just like I said, the intentional removal of civil rights, of murdering people, of attacking people, all of the major players that took part in the war practiced total war in some way or another. And so I think that's important to recognize, of not just the devastation of battles, but the devastation that took place in people's day-to-day life, the deaths that took place of civilians who were targeted and used either for ideology, racist ideology, or as an opportunity to change the outcome of a war. Okay, so that's where we're going to end. We're going to look and move into the consequences of all of this with the emergence of the Cold War next time.